So I never really considered Ugetsu a horror movie, but then again, it does have supernatural elements in it, involving a ghost story. So that and the fact that it's one of the greatest films ever made, I thought it'd be appropriate to include in my Halloween series. Ugetsu is a film I always wanted to talk about, and it's one that I always watch alongside Sancho the Bailiff. Both are actually pretty different stories, but they both have to deal with similar dramas about wartime and its effect on the average person during feudal Japan. Both of these films were also created by the excellent director Kenji Mizoguchi. So if you haven't seen Ugetsu or Sancho the Bailiff, I don't care who you are, you need to watch both of these excellent films right now. So, Ugetsu released in 1953. It's technically a samurai movie just because it takes place during the 1600s in Japan. Also, it features samurai in it. But this one instead focuses on the peasants, and just the negative effects that war and samurai have on them. So, right in the beginning during the title screen, it tells us the setting. It takes place in early spring during the 16th century Japan. This was a time period of persistent civil war. It drew the country into a bit of chaos. If I ever get a time machine, this will not be the time period that I choose to visit. So right in the beginning, we see the dangers of life during the Civil War period in Japan. We are shown it visually instead of just being told about it. We see villages getting raided by soldiers, food and people were scavenged and treated as value. Actually, a scene that stood out to me was when the peasant families are trying to go to town to make trade. They come across the remnants of a boat that was raided by pirates. Fog and clouds surround them, and the fear of what could be in those waters is real. The fear is just as present as any horror film. I'll say even more so because it shows the horrors of what real people could be turned into. All it takes is a little desperation. Mizoguchi actually changed the setting of the original story that this was based on, and he made it this time period for the film. Keep in mind that he was making this movie only 6 or 7 years after the end of the Pacific War. At that time, Japan was economically depressed. And I think this film is in some ways a way to reflect back on the very recent experiences of many ordinary Japanese people at the time. I think he was pointing out some values that he feared had been lost. The point of showing a vivid picture of the Japanese past is in many ways to underline just how different it is compared to what Japan has become in the present. The full title is really Ugetsu Monogatari. It means Rain, Moon, Stories. U is rain, Getsu is moon, and Monogatari is an informal word for story. Mizoguchi tried something different from the stylistic practices that made him famous in his early films in the 1930s and 40s. Here he tries a very straightforward type of storytelling, and it's mainly done in mid-shot with fades to black and fades from black, signaling passing time. While this is very simple, it owes something to Hollywood cinema at the time. But it's not at all storytelling that was ripped off from Hollywood. He in fact rejects many of the conventions of Hollywood storytelling. You'll find that there's a few scenes that almost feel like the director wants us to pay attention to them. And that's because some of these scenes will get foreshadowed later on in the film. This is something Mizoguchi does with his other films as well. How can we forget the tree branch scene from Sancho the Bailiff? So, to talk about the story, I'm gonna have to get into some spoilers, and honestly, I'm just gonna say, go and watch this movie now. It's not only an excellent samurai movie, but it's also one of the greatest movies I've ever seen. Just like with Sancho the Bailiff, it's incredibly paced, especially considering it's an old movie. I'll even say it's better paced than most films that are out now. You'll find yourself easily getting drawn into this world, and soon you'll just forget it's a movie. I really only felt the drag a little bit in the middle, and surprisingly it was the scene with the ghosts. I just felt that there was a little bit too much dialogue at this part, but in the end though, it's context that was needed, so I'll forgive it. So yeah, go out and watch it, or just stick around and hear me discuss the story. So the story follows two couples that are drawn into the life of Civil War, and it basically shows how it affects them. It shows the differences in how the characters react to war. Mainly the differences between the way the women react and the way the men react. The film actually doesn't have one central main character. It cross-cuts between the situations of two different protagonists. We have Genjuro and his wife Miyagi and their child Genichi. And then there's Genjuro's younger brother Tobei and his wife. Tobei is kind of the goofy comic relief character. He's a peasant but has this strong desire to become a samurai, which is something that was almost impossible at the time, especially for someone that was such a low class to be rising to the high class of a samurai. But hey, a guy could dream if he wants. I like how every time he sees a samurai, he'll just freak out like a little kid. And then he gets scolded by his wife and told to stick to your trade or you'll regret it. I could probably relate to this. Genjuro, on the other hand, has a skill in pottery, and he plans on profiting from the war by making and selling pots. It's interesting watching the strange contraptions that they had back then, and I'm sure they're 100% accurate. Especially considering how, anal Mizoguchi was about being a perfectionist and depicting the time period as authentically as possible. He'd end up doing things like making the entire cast wait an entire day just because a prop wasn't ready. And that's probably why some people who worked with him just absolutely hated him. But in the end, at least he gave us some awesome films. Eventually, both men achieved their dreams. But by doing so, they also lose everything. With Tobei, he wanders from his wife and brother, a lot of time passes, he clumsily kills a samurai and steals the head of a foe that the samurai had killed. Turns out it was a general, and presenting this trophy to the samurai lord, he is praised and given a horse, a house, and men to follow him. It's kind of like winning the lottery at the time. Filled with pride, he brings his men for the night to a brothel, only to find that his wife was raped by soldiers after he abandoned her, and now she's become a prostitute. The horror aspect comes into play when Genjuro comes into contact with Lady Wakasa. First, Genjuro visits a fabric shop, imagining his wife's joy when he brings her more beautiful dresses. But then Lady Wakasa appears, suggesting that she really likes his pottery and that he should go to her castle. He's memorized by her strange beauty. At the castle, she drifts from behind screens and curtains, and regarding his pots, asks him how such beauty is created. It's implied then that he's spending a lot of time with Lady Wakasa. We hear him say that he never dreamed such pleasures even existed. But Genjuro should have then taken warning, especially when he heard the voice of the lady's dead father. Lady Wakasa also advises him not to bury his talents in a small village, and instead marry her. And while Genjuro's fooling around with this ghost, his wife Miyagi is killed by a soldier. I felt that ultimately its central theme has to do with men chasing after their dreams. But instead of succeeding being a good thing, here it teaches us that what we want is already in front of us, and pursuing a wild dream is just going to lead us to losing what we have. It's definitely different from stories that just tell us to chase our dream and that's how we'll find happiness. Here it shows us the more realistic results, and basically what happens when you pursue something that maybe you aren't meant to have, and just to appreciate what you already have. In the end, both men damage their lives and the people around them, and in some cases the damage is permanent. So Kenji Mizoguchi's Ugetsu is an unforgettable and beautiful supernatural drama about the tragedy of man's ambitions, and it can be considered one of the best films of all time. It's definitely a ghost story, and in some ways, it's a horror movie, just because it shows a lot of horror. So you should definitely seek this one out. It's potentially a life-changing film, and it's one you're not going to forget. Mizoguchi is one of the titans of Japanese film, and Ugetsu and Sancho the Bailiff are both his best. Anyway, thanks for watching.